People ask me what culinary school I went to. My answer is India. I learned that you don't add masala just to the food. You add it to everything you do. I learned that flavour is more than a taste. It's a sight, it's a sound, it's a science. In India, I found the secret masala spices that make all the difference. The joy with which you cook, the love with which you serve.
Incredible India.
Volumes that perhaps you will be buying from the Kindle, or on the Kindle, or maybe you can have hard copies as well. So without much ado, may I request Dr. Robbins to address this August gathering regarding his collection and his passion. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Robbins.
Thank you very much, Maitree, and I thank you for all that you've done to make this a professional thing. Let's see if I can share my screen with you. So the question was, how do we set up something that would be all inclusive? First of all, you see 3 volumes with hundreds and hundreds of illustrations, majority of which are from my collection. The 3 cover illustrations show the spectrum of the collection. The first is a picture of the Gaikwad Baroda, painted photograph. The second is a Kutch painting, and the third is a gold medal of Rajkumar College, Rajkot. In these 3 volumes, we hope to introduce many ways of looking at things. The digital copies are available across the world from Amazon. Hard copies are available from Amazon all across the world, except in India, where they're now available at Pathi. So the next thing is, how did I get started in this? One day I was walking down Madison Avenue and saw a beautiful Bikaner painting and fell in love with it. There was nothing about what it was. And here's a painting from Kutch in the collection. Now, if you look at this painting, see how I go from this painting to something entirely different. If you notice in the lower right-hand corner and in the middle, there are 5 Africans. And there were all sorts of Africans in Kutch. I'm having trouble with the mate, Ashley. I have taken this to work on Africans in India and also on Ashley. I'm having trouble with my Ashley. The thing is not working.
Which thing's not working?
Okay, now it's working. Okay. I'm sorry for that thing. As you can see, my brains is with these things and not with technology. So I took this painting of Africans and have taken it further. We've done 5 volumes and an exhibit that went across the world on Africans in India. It may surprise many people to learn that there was an African-ruled state in India called Sachin, and here we have a state gazetteer from the collection. On the right-hand side, a painted photograph from the collection. I'm sorry for the delay.
There you go.
Okay.
I had to plug in your keyboard.
I've also taken this to do a series of books about Jews in India. And of course, there were Jews, indigenous Jews in India, in Gujarat. In a book I did about Indians, then Indian art and Jews, I have several chapters devoted to Baroda, where Sayajirao employed Jewish artists and Jewish advisors. Well, how did I get to this strange place? I think if you start with a narrative, you're already there. What I'm concerned about is that many people feel the less they know about subject, immediately they plug in some general impression, and that's the answer. I'm trying to go down an infinite number of paths using my archival collection as a search engine. This started with something called current contents. When I was in medical school, I used current contents to access all the journals. When I became a psychiatrist, I did the life sciences, arts and humanities, and social sciences. And what I found is that everybody had a different answer. So my approach was quite different. In psychiatry, we had the Freudians, and the Freudians talked about the Oedipus complex. So I went back and looked at the Oedipus myth itself. And what I discovered is, yes, Oedipus tried to kill his father and marry his mother, but that was after they tried to kill him. And then if you went back in Oedipus's family, you'd find that generation after generation, it was parents trying to kill sons, mothers and fathers. And the only time Oedipus and his father ever got together was when they were ghosts and tried to do negative things to their descendants. This led me to say, why do we not see this? The information is there. All you have to do is copy it down. When you're dealing with complex situations, major elements are always suppressed, dissociated, and discarded. Clarity and coherence come from favoring things. So I was particularly concerned about this in India, because people will talk about India and as if it's a timeless place that is unchanging, that everywhere in India is exactly the same, that something that you read about some holy man applies to people, all Indians. And so I undertook to write about the subject and the material rather than to address an audience. You can lose a lot of people that way. What I also found is that specialists had a lot of information. This included numismatists, art historians, and philatelists. And the use of multiple sources exposed misinformation, contradictions, and gaps in knowledge. I learned to take things not at face value, because when you look at the actual data, you see how you have to understand what is written and not take it just because it's on the thing. Take a simple set of coins from Kutch in the mid-19th century. The second series of coins are done in the name of the Mughal emperor. At this point, the Mughal emperor had no power in Kutch, but they're the names of the ruler, the local ruler, and the Mughal emperor. And if you look at even the date, is not clear. On one side, the date is frozen. So as they minted new coins in every year, that date didn't change. On the other side, the date changed. They even issued coins in the name of the Mughal emperor until 1859. This does not prove that they were for the Mughal emperor. It does not prove that the Mughal emperor had any adherents in Kutch in 1859. The most shocking thing that happened was I recovered a collection of stamp paper that I had made as a boy in the 1950s. I have no recollection of collecting it, but it's a huge carton of material. And there were a number of things that interested me about this. First of all, they were all from the princely states. And at that point, I was only collecting paintings. So Congra was very famous in my way of thinking. I knew this place Bamra because Bamra had issued postage stamps. But I didn't know there was all this information on documents. And since that time, I've handled over 200, through the collection, over 200,000 of such documents. Now, this is a simple document talking about somebody suing in court because he's claiming that he was cast out of his caste. He was outcasted. I didn't think that such things were decided by courts. This led me to do exhibits based on this. And one of the subjects I picked up was the Indian states. So I used postcards, miniature paintings, art, shadow figures, maps, correspondence, fiscal and postage stamps, paper money, cigarette cards, whatever, stock certificates, whatever I could do. And I developed an exhibit which went to the Gandhi Center in Washington, to Philatelic Museum, and to the convention of the Association of Asiatic Studies. And it had several sections: geography, rulers, legitimacy of rule, administration, lifestyle of the princes, monetary and financial affairs, industry, commerce, and incorporation into India. Now, some of these things were unfamiliar to me. I didn't find any stamped paper and documents of Congra. At that time, I realized that Congra had been annexed by the British, no longer existed. So it was like it was non-existent. But yet there were these other places that I'd never heard of, like Malakotla. I didn't know its importance in the history of Sikh-Muslim relations. And the particular document that intrigued me talked about involuntary commitment, psychiatric commitment. I started an interest in medical history. This led to an exhibit at Columbia University and the National Library of Medicine on medical pluralism. You see evidence for some of that here. In our books, we have extolled one of the great Maharajas, and actually his original title was Thacker, even though he was a pucker prince. I put prince in quotes for the reasons that we discussed yesterday. And we can see on the right-hand side the statues and great reliquaries that were donated in his honor in 1935 at his Golden Jubilee. In the middle from the collection is an Italian picture of what it must be like, where you see him not as himself, but as a Orientalist, timeless image that could be used for any such Oriental potentate. What this meant to me was that every piece of information that we had could be used in a different way. Here's a few of the coats of arms from the collection. You see in the right-hand upper coats of arms, a lion. This is from Junagadh, which had the only Asiatic lions. The bottom two are from different Jalak states, different Rajput states. One you can see is a Jala Rajput, but it has the Orioles, which I'll describe later during the series. And the other has the clan ancestor emerging out of a fire. So to understand this, I took this away from the questions of power. This has been described by a historian as ornamentalism, in which hierarchy was created, tradition was created, chivalry and ceremony was all about honors and glory and horses and robes and so on and so forth to shore up power. But in some ways, this was also a theater state, a British theater state, to shore up power that they really didn't have. But this also boosted the power and honor and izzat of the princes. Take Ranji, the cricketer. His emphasis on royal honor was based not only on his state traditions, but on regional Indian imperial politics. He was a cricket star, leader of Indian princes, a jewelry connoisseur, a patron of elaborate displays for visiting British officials, a paragon of the landed gentry in his English and Irish estates, and a loyal participant in the imperial projects of the Raj and the British Empire. But this gave him not only a pan-Indic view, but a global view. To me, I tried to maintain multiple levels of consciousness. I'm interested in documenting in 1877 the fact that the British created this great extravaganza, a Durbar, to declare Victoria Empress of India, but I'm also aware that this was done in the middle of a famine. I'm also aware that the questions of honor were also not talked to necessarily reality. They talked to legitimacy. I mentioned already how many of the state's coins continue to refer to the Mughal emperors long after there was no Mughal empire. Here is a late 19th century picture in Kutch of an award that they were given in the 18th century by the Mughal emperor. There was no Mughal emperor at that time. So we're all concerned here about the legitimacy of power and rule. The British claimed it was based on usage rather than treaty or contract. The British acted as the paramountcy, expressed sovereignty, a de jure reality. Now, if you notice this postcard on the left-hand side, it shows you the whole thing. It shows you the King Emperor, and below him the Viceroy was a 31-gun salute, and some of the so-called Indian princes. Well, if you look at these people, you'll see there's the Rana of Nepal. So was Nepal a princely state? Or was Nepal a state under British control? This whole question of how to number the states, big and small, is a constant battle. On the right-hand side, we see pictures from the collection of the investiture of the Nawab of Sachin, an African, in a state near Surat, in 1930. So all this ceremony was for a purpose. So were these people just the toadies of the British? We spent a lot of time talking about this in terms of how the Maharajas and the Nawabs boasted their own izzat, their own power, their own legitimacy. And so you see in the right coins in the name of the commander of the sovereign band, and things referring to their history: saddle is home, saddle is throne. In the center, we have a very interesting set of controversial images. I've spent a lot of time with the Illustrated London News and some great color portraits in other European publications and publications from places like Azerbaijan and Turkey, showing the whole history of this period. There was no internet. The social media were these newspapers, postcards, and so on and so forth. And this particular one in the center shows something interesting. In 1911, the Gaekwar Baroda did not, quote, did not follow protocol, and he snubbed the King Emperor by his thing. So here are the actual images taken at that time, and you can look at them closely in the book and judge for yourself the extent to which he did that. So this represents the first part of the lecture, just giving you some idea of how somebody who is a psychiatrist and a collector, which means in effect that they have very strange and unusual interests, try to use diverse materials. So the second part, I'm going to go to a different thing. I'm going to go to the question of geography and maps and where that leads you. Thank God for all of you that there's going to be no test at the end of this, as you'll see when you look at maps and have to answer simple questions. I dare anybody to give me a definition of Saurashtra, Gujarat, or Malwar that in any way encompasses all of its uses. For example, at the time of independence, many of the states of what is now Gujarat state banded together and into a new entity called Saurashtra, and you can see these overprinted on their stamps. This is the most confusing thing. A letter from the Dewan of Junagadh states that Saurashtra is the ancient name for the territory of this state. So his state, Junagadh, was also Saurashtra. And Saurashtra had other sorts of things. So in the book, we go into all the different ways in which that term was used and the different names, because sometimes the state is called Junagadh, Saurashtra, Sarath, and so on. It's when you look at maps that you realize how confusing this all is. Here are two maps, India in 1792 and 1845. Now, if you look at the center on the left, you'll see a little yellow patch, and that's Kutch. So Kutch was not under the control of whoever was under the control in this sort of orange area that goes across the center of India. And that's what was so-called under so-called Maratha control. In fact, very often you'll hear people talk about Gujarat and Kutch, as if Kutch is not in Gujarat. The map of 1872 shows a big patch of Maratha territory, but by 1845, that has become British territory. The states at this point are seen in yellow and are seen as if they're different than British India. That's confusing because there were states there and hundreds of states during Maratha times, but they're seen as if it's all Maratha territory. Here, India is divided into British and non-British India. Well, how did they manage this thing? The British supposedly ruled indirectly through residents and political agents who gave, quote, suggestions and gave advice. There were British representatives for the larger states, and there were small states had political agents who came away from state to state from a headquarters. Under a concept of divided sovereignty, full internal but no external powers were given to 118 salute states. Other states were classified in terms of the extent of jurisdictional powers. For example, at one point, there were 117 non-salute states. So these didn't have gun salutes, had limited internal jurisdiction, but they were in full relationship with the government of India. And then there were non-jurisdictional states. That was the majority of states where British political agents exercised some or whole more civil and criminal jurisdiction. And the British political agent was more of a district officer than an advisor. So how do you run this? Well, the top image is an image that you very often see, the idea that the princes were toadies, and John and Maitree yesterday and Akshay did a lot to try to dispel this erroneous notion. But it talks about a placid population in which a few despots control everything and give everything to the British. I think a more accurate thing is the bottom image, which shows Queen Victoria as a little old lady who lives at a show, and her crown as Empress of India is falling off as she tries to attend to the Irish, the Africans, the Indians, the Afghans, and everybody else. So what was the correct number of states? Everybody seems to know that there should be a correct number of states. One British authority in 1893 claimed there was 629. Lee Warner in 1910 said 693. The Indian Statutory Committee in 1930 counted 562. In the picture before that you saw of the postcard with the King Emperor, that included Nepal because its de facto rulers, the Ranas, were Rajputs, in close association with the British. Prior to 1935, the Shan states were counted because Burma was administrative part of the Indian Empire. So what about all of these states? Were they all states? On the right-hand side, we see stamps and a document for Mongrel. Was Mongrel a state? It was a big place. It had a port, a Verval, or was it a mediaized Taluka, whatever that means, tributary to Junagadh? So what I've done is I've collected literally a shelf full of the memorials that were sent by the Sheikh of Mongrel to the British, trying to establish it as an independent state. So the number of states kept on changing. So we have to see that states were being created and destroyed all along. In 1911, Benares, for the first time since 1795, became a state, and new states like Jedpur were created in the 20th century. The Warka settlement in 1807 in Gujarat established the legitimacy of a number of microstates. All along, you have the creation, the annexation of states. You have creation of new states by exchanges of property, which I'll describe. You have the attachment scheme of small states to big states during World War II and accession to India. So I took the 1939 Gazetteer, which was published by the government of India, and I came up with 369 states of different sorts, plus 168 civil stations and non-jurisdictional talukas under Tana circles, which some people would consider states. So this totaled, let's see, 537 states in what is today Gujarat alone. That's just in Gujarat. So what were some of these states? A very strange sort of things. There were a number of states that were not owned by a single ruler, but by shareholders. For example, Amarpur, 2 square miles, 407 population, was owned by 4 shareholders. And we see that these places even issued stamps. Banta Baramajnu had 3 Muslim chiefs. Bagasra in Western Kathiawar had 3 main shareholders with some judicial powers, and 3 other shareholders that didn't have judicial powers. That was in 1896. A couple of decades later, there were still 4 shareholders. So what was the process of consolidation here? In 1896, there were 16 main rulers, I'll call them that, in Jedpur Taluka, each owning something having more powers than others and sharing particular villages in many cases. So a village might be owned by 5 guys, and 5 other guys might own the adjacent village. One person traded his shares, and Durbar Shri Vala Mulu Sarag, his state was part of Jedpur Taluka. It was also known as Jedpur Tathada, and it became a Paka state. So he came from being a shareholder in this bigger entity to expropriating the name Jedpur. In the 1940s, over 300 states of Gujarat and Western India were attached to larger states. And so I've studied how this actually worked by collecting documents from these places. This was a rather interesting process because states like Junagadh made a list of, oh, I like this state, I like that state. I made this up for the British. Not all the small states like this, and as the tiny states pointed out, especially the local ruler of Godasar, and Bhavda was also active, that if they could attach smaller states to bigger states, there's no reason to think that they couldn't annex all the states and try to tell the bigger states that they should be supporting their independence of the small states to protect themselves. To make this even more confusing when one looks at the map, one sees that there were two governments in India. One was the government of India in Calcutta, and the other in Bombay was the government of the Bombay presidency, which included present-day Gujarat, parts of Maharashtra, and Sindh. And these were dueling governments. So this idea of this monolithic British control is not really there. One sees this provincial or presidency government completely at odds with the general Indian government. They governed under, these places were governed under the government of Bombay, the local governor, and they were set into certain agencies. Now look at the map of this agency and tell me how you governed it, how you would govern it all in relationship. But it didn't stay that way. It changed. It was a totally different thing in 1924, 1934. So prior to 1924, the states comprising Western India States Agency were under the government of India. In that year, a new agency was formed in direct relationship with the government of India, which included all the states of old Kathiawar, Kutch, and Banasantha agencies. In 1934 was a new redistribution. Palanpur was handed over to Rajputana agency, and Mayakantha agency, except Dantha, became part of the Western Indian States Agency, and on and on and on. In the Western Kathiawar agency in Rajkot included the Surat and Hala Prams. And it had 45 non-salute jurisdictional states and talukas and 4 Thana circles and so on and so forth. And the Eastern Kathiawar agency had its capital in Wadwan. Believe me, there's not going to be a test on any of this because one looks at it and one can see that this was so complex that nobody could figure it out or know how to handle things. And one goes a step further to a little bit later, and it becomes even more confusing. I mean, look at this. It's a mess. When one sees this, one understands that the time of Indian independence was a great time of consolidation in India and of revisiting the artificial barriers that had been created in the past. So in the 1940s, all these states like Mansa State and Versada and so on and so forth were attached to bigger states like Baroda. And so I've documented all of this material. There's also documents to show how this worked out. Now, that should be a simple matter. I should be able, everybody knows what Gujarat is. But in 1933, Gujarat was owning the areas, it was Gujarat States Agency, which is owning the areas shown on this map, a few of which are not even in Gujarat today. And associated with this, in this sort of purplish color, was Baroda State. Now, if you look at Baroda State, you see several things. All of these colored areas are Baroda State. Look at this. Look at the hundreds of different enclaves of territory interspersed with the territory of many other states. So how would you govern this sort of thing? First of all, there were multiple currencies. So we had an article covering all the multiple currencies. There was the Kalda, there was the Baba Shahi, there was the Shikai, and the role of Shroffs in handling these difficulties. We got the official rates of exchange, even for counterfeit coins and coins of states that no longer existed, which were in circulation, together with the coins of various coins of Baroda. Okamando was governed by Baroda. When I say governed, I'll use the word loosely. But it was a very important thing, though it was very far away from the capital, because it was the site of Dwarka, and the site, a prestigious site because of the temples there. Finally, under Sayajirao, they started even put a port on. So our books trace the history of Baroda's rule through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, and the changes there. You could build a whole history of 3 volumes just on that. Let's talk a little about the economic history, because Maitree is going to be speaking about the economic history of Baroda. Sayajirao did a wonderful job of promoting industrialization and modernization and education in Baroda. Sees how important his work was when one looks at the stock certificates that were created. But we're talking here about something that came from the top, that this Maharaja really directed what the state should be like. But one looks at the history of Baroda, one sees something that is very interesting. That one has to study the businesses as well as the wars in the dynasty. And what we're talking about here is the question of, in the 18th century, where there was war and chaos throughout what is present-day Gujarat. The things, why was the economy relatively robust? And why were there famines after peace was created? So one has to talk about the importance of economic history, which takes us away from maps and geography. This is the third of 4 parts of this lecture. That was a long lecture. I want to give you some idea of the scope. Here, I'm more interested in the way that I was able to use stamped documents and so on to produce all the images of rulers of even very small states. And one can pick up the whole history in a single image. For example, if one looks at the one in the upper left, one sees the history of Junagadh. One sees the Kathy horse in the lower left-hand corner, the ports in the upper left-hand corner, Girnar forest, Girnar mountain with all its shrines in the upper right-hand corner, and the Asiatic lion in the right. It gives you a whole synopsis of what Junagadh state was about. But there were also a lot of very small states. So one was able to document these with these various stamps and stamp papers, even places at 1,000 population. At one point, I had 500 documents from Vaidya state in Pahari state with a population of 994. And so a lot of these states worked through political agents. So I've documented who the political agents were using the collection, and with the actual documents of how things were handled by the British through the courts. One would think that postage stamps and postal systems would not be a fertile area for understanding government. Now, I presented to you a system, a gradated system, where big states had full powers and small states had some powers, and then there were states with no powers at all. Well, one looks at the preeminent princely states, they're Baroda, Gwalior, Hyderabad, Kashmir, and Mysore. Only Gwalior was permitted to overprint Indian stamps and that had franking power throughout India. Hyderabad had a postal system, but its stamps couldn't take one outside of Hyderabad state. Now, one looks to the area that we're talking about, one sees stamps in Jasdan, Naunagar, Rajpipla. And this is not just an obsolete custom that died out early. Morphy only began to issue stamps in 1931 and Jasdan in 1942. So there was no correlation between the level of powers and the issuing of stamps. Baroda did not issue postage stamps or had a fully functioning internal postal system. So I made a list of all the stamp issuing states. So I've shown you two types of stamps: fiscal stamps, which we have stamps from all things, and postage stamps, where just a few states issue them. And there's no relationship between the size of the state and its when it issued stamps and how long it issued stamps. It was only in Junagadh that there was, and Hyderabad, that there were sustained postal systems that issued their own stamps. So we have the documents creating the postal system. And in 1912, during the minority rule, there was demonetization of small coins, and the coins were re-dominated in annas and pies, and the system survived that. This postal system even survived the Nawabs. It continued to function until 1950. So we documented how this system worked, why it continued, and why it got a demise. Now, the postage stamp war over Junagadh continues to today. You see documents from the Nawabs of Junagadh. So let's go review this history. There was mostly a Hindu population. There were longtime Muslim rulers. The Nawab decided to accede to Pakistan and ran off with his dogs to the Dakota Plain to Karachi. And decades later, they were still claiming Junagadh state, and any number of stamps issued by Pakistan claiming Junagadh and Jammu Kashmir as Pakistani. So there's a stamp war there. This is the last of this very long section, talking about what can we say about British controls. Very often the princes or rulers died and they were succeeded by children, and there were residencies under their queens or under local authorities, or in many cases there was British administration. So we documented that. So the question that we wanted to take up was, what were the relative merits of British and native administration, trying to take us from all things. One of the things written by the Secretary of the Political Department deals exactly with this, and it was published in 1868, so you'll find that in the collection. But you'll also find a lot of information about Gandhi's family, which served as government administrators in Porbandar, Wankaneer, Shahpur, and Rajkot. 6 generations of Gandhis served Porbandar. Gandhi's father was prime minister in 3 states. So what are the examples that we have of something positive? The Nawabs of Junagadh had great conservation efforts that prevented the extinction of the Asiatic lion. And this was something they were very proud of. So in an album of a lion hunt in the collection, I found the actual numbers that were said to be there. And I've collected all sorts of pictures of the hunts in Junagadh. And talked about the problems of this, because Junagadh was made up of pockets of land interspersed with that of others. And even if they wanted to conserve the lions could just wander over to the territory of somebody else. The second thing I wanted to talk about was that there were different interests within the states. Take Palatana. Palatana is a state ruled by Rajput, but it's famous for its giant Jain shrines. So I've collected all sorts of images ranging from postage stamps to medals to posters of these photographs of these temples. And they're beautiful maps on cloth showing temples and photographs of temples built in the 19th century. And these temples were not built by local Jains. In fact, the population, Jain population of Palatana, I think it was 1% or something like that. But these were merchants from Bombay and Ahmedabad who built new temples in the 19th century. And we went on to describe a very particular way in which government worked in India. There were constant conflicts between the Jains, who were very wealthy. In fact, during the early 19th century, almost all of the currency of the revenues of the state of Palatana were owed to these Jain moneylenders. And so there were a lot of conflicts about that, and there were also conflicts about controls that the local ruler, the Thakur Sahib of Palatana, tried to put upon the Jains. And this was taken out in all sorts of memorials. And so what we did was we documented all the different approaches that the Jains had to take control of these shrines over the centuries. And what you found is very often, considering that they were across India and had access to imperial rulers like the Mughals and the British, that they tried to work through them to establish their rights against the local Rajput rulers. And so we have some of the memorials, and we've covered exactly how this happened. A trust based in Ahmedabad pursued cases against Palatana with British Indian authorities, and over and over again, these documents, and they're in the thing. I mentioned that Gandhi's parents and ancestors were traditional administrators in the princely states. So the question that I asked was a different question. What were the characteristic ways of descent in these states? Brahmins could fast, Rajputs became outlaws, merchants could close their shops, create work stoppages. There were obstinate demands based on threats to harm themselves, which would then bring dishonor on the local ruler, or fasting till demands were met. So one can see how Gandhi did or did not take these local methods of protest into his freedom movement. And I want to tell you something interesting about fasting in a minute. This is a poster in the collection. It shows 7 great men with Gandhi at the center. And the first 3 are sort of like Krishna and Buddha and Jesus. Well, you sort of get that. Tolstoy you get because Gandhi built Tolstoy House in South Africa. But the bottom 2 will shock you, because they deal with revolution and they deal with fasting and the hunger strike. I just told you the hunger strike was from West India. So why would you include Lenin in this? Because whoever did this saw Lenin as somebody who was a revolutionary, overturning the old order and things in terms of the old order. But the one on the lower right is Professor McSweeney. I don't know how many of you know who Professor McSweeney was. When we think about world revolution and Gandhi and India, we think more of nonviolence and civil disobedience. In the books that I did about Africans, we had visions of a better world. Martin Luther King's Teacher's Pilgrimage to India and the origins of African-American nonviolence with Gandhi's movements, the relationship between Ambedkar connecting Dalit and Black struggles in the 1940s. These are the things you think of. You don't think of Professor McSweeney. So who was Professor McSweeney? Professor McSweeney was one of the inventors in the West of the hunger strike. He was an Irish patriot who died. Lastly, I want to leave you with the knowledge that people from the princely states, even that term suggests that they were under the British and you should see them under the British. This is not the case. The families of both Jinnah and Gandhi came from states in Gujarat. Jinnah's family originally came from Gondal in Gujarat. There were particular fighters, freedom fighters, who were deposed or threatened by the British. The lands of Gopal Das Desai were confiscated because of his work as a leader of the Indian National Congress. And also Sardar Patel also had his origins in the princely states of India. And I wanted to give you the words of the Maharaja of Drangadra, who considered him a great consolidator of a subcontinent. And he said he was the Iron Man of India. After Prince Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who united the small country of Germany must count as little or nothing. In other words, his accomplishment was greater even than Bismarck. And Drangadra issued a medal for the accession to India in 1947, and he was later the ceremonial governor of the native state of Saurashtra. So I see the late 1940s as the 1940s themselves as a time when there was the attachment scheme followed by the consolidation of hundreds of states and cities into the new Republic of India. As Arvind Singh of Mewar put it, one category states there was a peaceful transfer from monarchy to democracy, impossible without the support of the rulers of the states. And such mass sacrificial action is unique in world history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I will invite my co-discussant of this session, Ms. Mitch Frass. As you can read from the pamphlet that has been circulated, he is a senior curator of special collections of the Kislak Center University. And of course, as the pamphlet mentions, that perhaps Dr. Robbins' collection will be a home to the institute that he's working in. So I think you can just talk about your observations, and then we can take the questions if we have time.
Great, thank you so much. Many thanks to Ken, and Dr. Nalwala and Dr. Sabnis, and the august Mumbai Asiatic Society, who I think highly of. My dissertation work was on the first British courts in Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata, and I had the pleasure of spending some time there, although never at the Asiatic Society. And I always tell students here at Penn, we have a lot of medievalists and European medievalists, and I say if they really want to study Dante, they must go to Mumbai to look at the manuscripts there. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this, and you know, to respond a bit to what Ken has been saying. We're fortunate at the university here in Philadelphia to be the future home of the Robbins collection, which is exciting and also daunting. You've seen just a small sliver of Ken's collection. You can only imagine the wonders in there. I think highlighting what a few things Ken has talked about that make it exciting for us, and explain why an American university would be so excited to have this collection, and what we think it will provide for researchers and scholars in the future. I think anyone who has heard Ken talk before and heard him this evening will know just how his brain works as this sort of, he mentioned the early search engine sort of before Google, that he can go from the Oedipus complex to Jews in Gujarat to postal stationery to Jinnah. I mean, it's kind of amazing. And I think that is what got us interested in this collection, and what I think will provide meaning for students in the future. That is, you know, if you go to India or you go to any part of the world, the stories and the sources for history are often concentrated where they were made. You know, each of those small princely states Ken was talking about has some successor state or some body or family that is the nominal or no longer the steward of their official records or the official government publications. You have many state libraries, you have state archives that, you know, are focused on one particular state or one region or one family. And historians can learn a lot from those archives, and they can dig deeply into one particular thing. What Ken's collection does is show us the sort of kaleidoscope of the subcontinent in the last 500 years, with a special notice in the last 150 years, across all of these distinctions. Like, there is no one place you could go for all princely states history. There's no like, you know, one princely states library that encompasses them all. So having this collection at our university, we think will be exciting for students to be able to break into their research, to make new discoveries, to have Gondal alongside material on, you know, Malayalam-speaking Jews in the same repository will spark curiosity and make new research questions that people who only spent all of their time looking at one royal family would never be able to ask. So that's what makes Ken's research and his collecting so exciting for us. It's the sort of broad search engine likeness, and also his focus on sources and materials that are too often ignored in official sources. I mean, for good reason. You know, I occasionally talk with some of my colleagues who are catalogers and archivists here at the university, and we were just trying to imagine if you were a princely states proto-archivist 70 years ago, 100 years ago, how you would shake your head at the volume of stamped paperwork and stationery and all this stuff being pumped out of the bureaucratic mechanism, and how you might throw up your hands and say, you know, we're not capturing this all. And what Ken has done is dip his hands across the world of the princely states to gather that evidence from hundreds of different locales and bureaucracies and bring them together in one place that would have been very challenging for anyone else. And it's a miracle Ken has been able to do it himself, and also across formats. I think too often in scholarship, in libraries and museums, there are hard distinctions that come more from history than common sense around, you know, Ken was showing us some medals and coins. Most libraries wouldn't touch coins with a 10-foot pole. That they're like, oh, yeah, this is a problem for museums. They deal with coins, they deal with pottery, they deal with all this other stuff. Whereas I think Ken has opened my eyes and many at the library here to the inscriptional value, epigraphical value of coins. They are in fact written media in many cases, and you can't understand a lot of the documentation without looking at the sources broadly. You know, the rulers of a particular princely state didn't think like historians and say, well, you know, paper and printed books and coins, they're all different. They should be in different places. They have nothing to do with each other. And that's just not how history works. So we're really excited by the breadth in Ken's collection of visual media, paintings, alongside documentation. And you get just a glimpse in his presentation. I was taking some screenshots of his numbers on princely states in India because someone always asked me about this. I was like, okay, I can pull this up later and try to have an answer within the nearest 100 or something. But you get a sense of just how this excitement in the collection can translate to student outcomes. And I think, you know, one reason, you know, we're able to do this in the US is to bring together things outside of any particular state or region within the subcontinent and sort of mush it all together through Ken's lens as a collector. We have a long history as a South Asia Studies Center in the United States. A lot of quite famous American and South Asian American and Indian scholars have taught at the university over the years and turn out a sort of a new generation of graduate students every 5 or 6 years. And it'll be great to have people trained. I can imagine them starting in the Robbins collection here in Philadelphia and then traveling to Mumbai or to Ahmedabad or somewhere doing their field work and approaching these official archives through the lens of what they've learned from Ken's collection to say, you know, I've called up the 20 ledgers of tax returns from, you know, this particular talukdar or something. But, you know, in Ken's collection, I saw that there was a photograph showing the talukdars sipping tea with this guy. Like, do you have anything about their relationship with the British resident? And sort of being able to ask these new questions based on Ken's expansive vision is what makes me really excited. So I think I will defer to other people's questions, but, you know, just to say in the future, we hope to have the Robbins collection cataloged and ordered and ready for scholars to use, although I don't know that anyone will match Ken's sort of encyclopedic grasp of all of this. Every time he explains different parts of the collection to me, I have to sort of remember, okay, right, so the exact history of Jews in Bollywood connect to, you know, Gujarati fishermen. Okay, it's through this movie. You know, he's got a really impressive range that we will try to recreate here, but probably imperfectly. So thanks everyone for allowing me to talk a little bit about Ken's collection, and looking forward to how he responds in some of these active questions I see here.
If I may intervene, we at the Asiatic will only be happy to host any scholars that come from American institutions and other international institutions to study, and we're happy to build every synergy that we can build.
Thank you. That's my dream, that we have no barriers.
Okay, so I think we can move on to the questions. We can maybe pick, I think the time is, we still have a little bit of time with ourselves. So Ken, would you like to
why don't you
address few queries and questions that, should I read them out for you?
Well, I think maybe you should be the point person in deciding what we talk about and give your opinion as well.
Okay, so I think out of the questions that I see here, there are a few questions which are with regards to the genesis of these states and the influence of the colonial influence on them. So, for instance, one question focuses upon, I'll just read out the question to you, that since you're talking about princely states and the modern systems which came into operation as a result of Western and Indian ideas, what was the response of people at large? So in your collection, if it is to put little in a format in your, if to speak the subaltern language, it is from above. We'll be talking about more about the rulers and their perspective, but when we talk about people at large, so is there any anything that really speaks about the people at large?
I think that's the first thing. The idea is not to close off discussion, but the more you talk, to make people realize what isn't being said, what isn't being discussed. I think we're starting to do better with women's history, elite women's history, which is different than the common women's history. I think we're doing better with business history, art history, but the question of the people is not being dealt with. I felt that one of the most important chapters in the book was written by the son of the former prime minister of Baroda State, a state that was mostly Hindu, ruled by Muslims, and nothing ever happened there. And what was the people's life like in those places? What was the day-to-day life? What were the festivals? What were the relationships between the Shias and the Hindus, and so on and so forth? I think that these are the stories that need to be told. And this idea that you can take a diverse population and summarize it, I think is erroneous. And I think that that was a good question to start with, because we should always start with what we have no idea about. Because otherwise we get lost in what we have and we think that that's the whole.
Yes, I agree with you. And there are lots of, we can say, possibilities that this work really opens up. Because traditionally we often think of political, social, cultural, and economic. But then there are a lot of gray areas which are a fusion of different sort of ideas. So I think that's what the book is about. It doesn't focus on one aspect of it. The books really focus on, this is just the beginning, and there is still a whole lot that needs to be done. So I can move to the next question, which is that do you think that the establishment of the colonial rule changed the systems that existed in the princely states, or do you think that the older systems continued? So I think the summary of the question is that since the princely states continued from 1857, that is when the Queen issues her proclamation. So since then, the rulers did not really have to fight, or there were no battles that they had to go to. So essentially there was a maintenance of law and order. So I think the question addresses the work carried out by the princely states, majority of these Indian states. So the question is that whether they continue to operate in a similar fashion, in the earlier fashion, or was there any change that you see through the photographs that you've collected, or maybe through different historical items that you have gathered together?
I think that there was a continuation, and one sees a lot of the parallels of these things over the years. And so, for example, what I was distressed about is 1857, 1858. If you pick up the encyclopedia of that list every episode of this, they barely at all mention Gujarat. Well, what was going on in Gujarat? So we documented that, but we also took it in a different way. First of all, we tried to talk about how this dealt with ongoing local concerns. And so you see the British at the time of the Walker settlement in 1807 favoring the small states and trying to create peace. You see them in 1857 favoring the Gaikwad Baroda over his opponent, Maharaja Gaikwad, who was against him, and the ruling Gaikwad was with the British. So he was against the British for that reason. And this is, I mean, nobody has put together that obvious fact, and that he saved actually from severe punishment at the hands of his relative by the British, and it then is such a thorn in the British side. So we're trying to put things actually as they happened, rather than the narrative that we wanted things to be. And I think this is the duty of a historian, to stick to facts, even if they don't all fit together. And I saw a lot of the questions were, you know, did the British allow things and so on and so forth? Very often these princely states were allowed, if you look at the numismatic history, the history of cash coupons and stamp money, a lot of these places were allowed to do things and got away with things that Baroda and Mysore couldn't get away with. I mean, for example, you have a postal system in Khetri state, Khetri, which was a Takana under Jaipur. You're saying, well, if they wouldn't allow Baroda to do it, how does Khetri have such a system? Or how does Dungapur have a system that nobody recognizes, that even stamp collectors didn't recognize until the 1960s, that there was this ongoing postal system? We don't have the documentation. And saving every bit of documentation will fit it all together later. It's an archival and archaeological pursuit. Dig it up and then you'll sort it out later.
Absolutely. So I think there is a question from a student. So she asks, sir, could you explain the process of how one treats a photograph as a primary source?
Well, there's several things. I'm looking at a wall of photographs, and in it there are two photographs of Raghuveer Singh when he got married into Jodhpur. Neither photograph shows a woman. It's a wedding. They're wedding photographs. They show the bride's family in Jodhpur. There's a painting of the Raghuveer Singh, the Maharaja of Bundi, with the Maharaja of Jodhpur, but no woman. One takes that as telling you that the women were not portrayed. So how did you do this if you were a conservative place and you want to emphasize your daughter? So I look and I find a medal from Mewar, where a daughter of the Maharaja is getting married to the Maharaja of Kishangar, and they don't portray him at all. You know, they use some sort of lettering to describe the wedding, but it emphasizes that Mewar is more powerful and higher ranked than Kishangar. So one can see how every time they do something, they're doing it for a purpose. And another thing that you see is that Indians like to layer things. Many of these paintings are painted over and made to look like as if they were miniature paintings that are two-dimensional. We don't have that kind of thing in the West. And you see the juxtaposition of past, present together as if they're all one. In America, we consider anything old that's last year.
Very true. So I think I'll take one last question, or maybe, one last question, and which is the series of lectures are interesting and intriguing. However, it is still missing on the content. From the princely states of Kathiawar, Saurashtra, that had around 222 independent princely states and enjoyed a geographical supremacy. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, we're just getting started. And, you know, for example, we will have something about the difference in Rajputs. So the question is about continuation. One can see that different Rajput clans held power, more power in those areas at different times. And that, you know, for example, the Rathas are not important. They're in Idar, for example. The Jalas are very important, but initially the Jalas were not the first ones there. So where did they come from? And one sees that these states, the thing is that if you came to my collection, I could document every one of those states with its history. And so this would be a one-shop place. And the collection has gone beyond that to other areas. For example, I've documented the first Iranian revolution, constitutional revolution. I mean, nobody outside of Iran knows that there was an important revolution in Iran in the first decade of the 20th century that completely changed world history. So I have over 1,000 images of that revolution. And so I'm trying to put this into some sort of thing. We're doing an exhibit. We're going to do an exhibit and a book about comparing what happened if we're going to deal with imperialism, and that's important in Indian history. One is to deal with French and British imperialism in the 19th and 20th century across the globe. This is a trans-global thing. One has to talk about the British trying to stop the slave trade and indenturing Indians in Asia and in the Caribbean, and how this all worked together. And India has to be seen in a global way, not just as an isolated place apart from the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And maybe what we have done, I think, to respond to that question is that we have talked about the princely states of Kathiawar, although not individually, because that will require a lot of time and space. But we have talked about Walker settlement in the volumes that we have written. So we have talked about the inception or the beginning of formation of, because we've talked about Bhaiyas, we have talked about the Walker settlement and how the division came into existence. And then throughout the volumes, especially the second volume, we've in view of the other talked about the formation of these states and how they were handled. And subsequently, I think when we're talking about in the third volume, I think towards the end of the second volume, we've also spoken about the agencies that were formed, especially the United States of Kathiawar or United States of Saurashtra. So particular individual attention has not been paid to these states, but they have been discussed at various points of time in three volumes that we have covered. So there are many questions. Dr. Robbins, if you think we should address them, or maybe we want to call it a day.
I think our audience has been very intrepid in listening to an old man ramble on about God knows what. But I think these things are important, and I appreciate the questions because I am interested in documenting every state, every takana, and doing everything I can if I see anything that will tell that history of any source to include it. And down to about 1,000, population of 1,000 or more, I think I have something from every place.
Okay, so I think one last question, which is, I think we can quickly respond to that. So going by Metcalfe's study, many states of India in the 19th century, royals had adopted Sasanic as a broad style for modern palaces with European influences, designing of private spaces. Does it hold good for Gujarat too? So basically, I'll respond to that. That is, when we talk about Baroda State, we do see this influence in the, if you ever happen to come to Baroda, then you must visit the Lakshmi Vilas Palace and see for yourself. Or you can just look at the online image of it, and you'll see that there is a blend of, you do see European influence in the architectural styles, and we have covered it also in the third volume. So I guess thank you very much. Yes, please.
You can see all the different styles over time. If you go to Drangadra, you can see the early styles in Alvad. And in the modern palace in Drangadra itself, you see the goddess Britannica with her minions. So you do see all of these influences. And in the book, we've covered the wall paintings, ranging from the wall paintings in Jamnagar and Sihor to the wall paintings in Art Deco style by a Portuguese artist in Morbi.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think I'll hand the mic over to, I think there's ASMRC, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. but kindly tell us to conclude the session today.